There is a version of Egypt's story that almost no one is willing to touch. Not the familiar tale of Narmer, pyramids, and golden death masks, but something older, colder, written in broken stone and dismissed with a shrug. It whispers that before the first recognized king ever wore the white crown of the south or the red crown of the delta, the land was ruled by a single radiant sovereign from the company of the gods, a being whose reign did not last 20 or 30 years, but an almost obscene span of time, thousands upon thousands of years, stretching back around 12,000 years before the Egypt we think we know even begins. Tonight I want to bring you into that forgotten corridor and lay out, slowly and carefully, why some of the oldest Egyptian records insist that the age of Pharaoh did not begin with a man at all. Before we sink into it, if you're here for long-form, careful, slightly dangerous history, the kind that doesn't insult your intelligence, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next deep dive we do together. And tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from, what time it is for you right now, and what pulled you into this question of lost epochs and god-kings in the first place. I read those. It helps me feel the circle we're building around these stories. One mind in many places, staring at the same puzzle. Picture the Nile Valley, not as we see it in postcards, but as a narrow artery of green clinging to a harsher, stranger planet. Long before dynasties, before hieroglyphs marched across temple walls in perfect rows, before anyone carved the name of Narmer on a pallet, Egyptian priest scholars were already looking backward. When they finally wrote their king lists and sacred histories, they did something that makes modern scholars deeply uncomfortable. They calmly stated that in the beginning the land was ruled by gods, then by their direct descendants, then by a line of semi-divine beings. Only after this immense prelude do the normal human kings arrive. The question is not whether we believe every claim. The question is why a civilization so obsessed with order would choose to structure its history like that. In a museum case, half ignored by casual visitors, sits a broken basalt fragment known today for preserving some of those reigns. On its worn surface, neat rows of signs record names and regnal years of early rulers. The later ones are plausible, the earliest are not. We see spans that run into the thousands of years for a single sovereign associated with the gods. In another damaged record on fragile papyrus, a similar sequence appears: divine kings, followed by enigmatic successors, their combined rule counted not in centuries, but in ages. This isn't wild internet speculation, it's what the priests themselves chose to transmit. Later chroniclers, drawing on temple archives now lost, repeat the same structure: gods, then god-born rulers, then heroes, then men. Now step into their mindset. These weren't bored scribes inventing fantasy for fun. These were specialists of memory, whose entire identity rested on accuracy, continuity, correct transmission of cult and chronology. When they carved king lists on temple walls, those lists were offerings in themselves, part of rituals meant to ensure the unbroken line of rule and cosmic order. To accuse them of carelessly inserting thousands of fictional years is to misunderstand what those texts were. Exaggeration is possible. Deliberate, systemic nonsense is less so. If they wrote that an exalted being from the Ennead or from among the elder powers ruled the two lands for a span beyond human life, it meant something inside their system. The most unsettling detail is not that multiple sources mention divine rulers. It's that they converge on a rough total, an immense era, on the order of 10 to 12,000 years, separating the first time of the gods' rule from the historically familiar dynasties. That number, hovering on the edge of the last great glacial meltdown, the drowning of coasts, the great rearrangement of rivers, has led generations of quiet researchers, some sober, some wild, to ask whether these priestly records are preserving a distorted memory of a real pre-catastrophic kingship, an authority that existed before Egypt as a state, before the Sahara as a desert, before history as we measure it. In the hymns and temple inscriptions, there is constant reference to a mythic golden age when the divine Lord of the sky, or his falcon-crowned heir, ruled directly upon earth, not as a vague presence, but as a king, enthroned, crowned, surrounded by a court, dispensing laws, judging enemies, measuring fields. This being is not described like a remote creator who never descends. He is portrayed like the prototype Pharaoh. The earthly kings of later times are said to follow his pattern, to sit upon his throne, to wear his crown. The implication is clear. Every human king is a copy. Somewhere behind the copies stands the original. Now imagine that original not as a man in white linen, but as a figure standing at the hinge of worlds, emerging in the age when ice sheets still haunted the horizons of the north, when sea levels were lower, when a different map existed. If survivors of whatever ended that world came into the Nile Valley carrying knowledge of architecture, astronomy, agriculture, and rule to a people still scattered along the river, how would that memory fossilize? Over millennia, it would simplify. One lineage would compress into one name. One circle of high initiates would compress into the gods. One epoch of their dominance would compress into a single, impossible reign. To the later temple elite, guarding an unthinkably long chain of tradition, the notion that this founding sovereignty was literally divine was not metaphor. It was the only wording heavy enough to carry the weight of before us. They called that remote age the first time, the foundation on which ritual, kingship, city planning, even festival calendars were modeled. Temples are aligned not randomly, but as if in dialogue with a sky that looked slightly different. The rituals are said to replicate ceremonies performed not by men but by that primeval royal presence. This is not how you write about a fairy story. This is how you speak about a constitution you did not draft but must obey. When we sift through what's left, shattered stone, second-hand quotations, partial lists, we find a recurring structure, a single great sovereign or a tightly bound group of divine rulers presiding for lengths of time that to us feel mythic, but to them were precise entries. They are often linked to gifts, teaching writing, surveying the land, dividing it into administrative regions, establishing shrines at key nodes, fixing the ideal proportions of temples, teaching how to track the rising of specific stars to predict the flood. In other words, designing the software of a civilization. Whether we label that Sovereign Horus, Ra, Atum, or a name now lost in lacunae, the job description is the same. If all of this were confined to one inscription, we could dismiss it as pious decoration. But the pattern surfaces in multiple places and genres: king lists, religious hymns, cosmological texts, later historical summaries written under foreign rule. Each time, the message is smuggled through. Human kingship is not original. It is a delegated office established by someone or something else. Later thinkers tried to tame this by allegory, arguing that the god-kings were just stars or forces of nature. Maybe. But allegory itself often grows from a root event dimly remembered and then spiritualized. When we place these Egyptian testimonies beside other ancient traditions, the resonance is uncomfortable. Elsewhere, we find lists of antediluvian kings ruling for vast spans, sages who descend and instruct, divine or semi-divine rulers who vanish before the normal dynasties start. This does not prove anything by itself. Myths migrate. But if entirely separate cultures are compelled to anchor their histories in an era of impossible reigns by more than human figures, either human imagination is oddly consistent, or there is a shared trauma or teacher lurking behind them all, refracted differently through local lenses. What I want you to notice is how deliberately Egypt hides this in plain sight. On the one hand, they are the masters of record, carving immaculate sequences of rulers, years, festivals. On the other, at the very root of that tree, instead of a clear human ancestor, they place a presence from the circle of the gods and give him an inhumanly long command over the land. It is as if, at the foundation stone of the whole edifice, they are saying, "The original Pharaoh is not one of you. He belongs to an order you cannot challenge. If there ever was such a being, call him a god, Ace, survivor of an earlier civilization, an entity we would now call something stranger. His reign's duration in the texts is not about literal birthdays, it is about priority, total precedence. He was ruling here before any of you were even conceivable. And if you inherit a country from someone like that, your whole ideology of kingship will bend around defending his design. You will model crowns, titles, regalia, and temple rites on that first pattern, whether you remember the details or not. You may forget the engineer's face, but you keep running his blueprint. Walk in your mind into a hypo-style hall. Columns like stone papyrus stalks, shadows deep, ceiling painted with stars. On some far wall, a careful list of kings is carved, offerings shown in neat rows before their names. The living king stands at the end of this line, legitimized by being its latest link. Somewhere beyond the damaged upper registers, where tourists' eyes rarely go, the list doesn't just vanish. It leaps into the age of the gods. The continuity is coded right there. No clean break, no democratic reset, only descent. That is the kind of quiet confession that keeps me coming back to these stones. We are left with three broad choices. 1. Ignore these early reigns as absurd propaganda, despite the cultural context that argues against random invention. 2. Treat them purely as spiritual metaphor, flattening them into psychological symbols. 3. Entertain, without flinching, the possibility that they preserve the warped silhouette of a reality we no longer possess, the memory of a non-human or ultra-human sovereignty that predated recorded Egypt by thousands of years, that reigned through cycles of climate and flood, and that only later generations, huddled in the ruins of that order, could describe as the Pharaoh of the gods. I'm not asking you to swear allegiance to any of those options yet. I'm asking you to sit with the discomfort of how consistent, deliberate, and integrated the idea of an impossibly ancient first ruler is in the Egyptian material once you strip away the tourist brochure version. Because once we accept that their own records claim such a figure existed, we earn the right to ask more pointed questions. What did he rule over? How advanced was that order? How did it end? And what fragments of his system were quietly built into the civilization we know as Egypt so thoroughly that we no longer see the join? Stay with that tension for a moment, you and I across distance and time zones, looking at the same fracture lines in the story we were given. If that lost sovereignty was real, even in part, then its fingerprints should still be findable. In temple orientations, in mythic titles, in suspiciously sophisticated early structures, in numbers that point not up to the clouds, but back to a date. That is where we're going next in this investigation, line by line through the surviving evidence, to reconstruct the profile of the one they remembered as ruling before the world reset. If you'd like me to keep unfolding this story, and start piecing together how that 12,000-year reign is encoded in the surviving texts, say, continue, and we'll go deeper together. When you begin to pull at the thread of this so-called first pharaoh of the gods, the evidence doesn't shout. It breathes in fragments, a chipped stone here, a damaged cartouche there, a later historian quoting a lost priestly source. So tonight, I want to walk you slowly through those pieces and treat you like what you are, not a passive viewer, but someone capable of holding ambiguity without immediately throwing it away, just because it doesn't fit the safe, laminated timeline in textbooks. If a 12,000-year reign is a memory, not a metaphor, it has to leak somewhere into the architecture, the star maps, the rituals, the lists, and it does. One of the most important clues sits like a black meteorite under glass, a fragment of royal chronology later called the Palermo Stone. On one side, among its carefully etched registers, there is a section that doesn't care about Narmer, Djoser, or any name a tour guide can easily pronounce. It catalogues kings from a time before the unified kingdom, and above even those, enigmatic figures linked not with towns and gnomes, but with gods. The lengths attached to some of these names extend far beyond a human life. Later fragments and parallels hint that, in its complete form, this monument connected divine rulers to measurable years, as if the scribes wanted you to understand. This was not an uncountable eternity, this was calendrical. Then there is that heartbreak of papyrology, the so-called Turin King List, or Turin Canon, crushed, incomplete, and yet devastating. When reconstructed, it presents in dry, hieratic script a sequence of reigns, historical kings we recognize, obscure rulers only the priests remembered, and at the top, an entire section dedicated to the gods and the spirits who ruled Egypt before mankind's pharaonic line. Not as unanchored myths, but with specific durations. So many years, so many months, so many days. The papyrus is damaged exactly where we want it whole, but enough remains to show intent. Someone in the New Kingdom, with access to temple archives now lost to us, believed they were preserving a real chronology of divine government. Centuries after those lists were composed, an Egyptian priest writing in Greek, working under foreign overlords, compiled a history of his land based on temple records. His original is gone. We have only fragments, quotes, and summaries. But what survives is consistent with the older material. He describes an age in which gods ruled Egypt directly for many thousands of years, followed by an age of god-descended or semi-divine kings, then an age of human pharaohs. Depending on how you combine the fragments, the total duration for the first category hovers in that unnerving band. An order of 10,000 years before the known dynasties. Modern commentators hand-wave it as exaggeration. But exaggeration in which direction? Up from nothing, or down from something we no longer accept? We need to be honest with each other here. Numbers in ancient texts can encode more than quantities. They can point to cycles, precessional periods, flood rhythms, celestial patterns. If you take that 12,000 not as a random boast, but as a scar left by the end of the last ice age, by the onset of stable climates, by catastrophic floods remembered worldwide, then the idea that Egyptian priests pinned their first divine kingship to just before that turning is not easily ignored. It's as if they were saying, "He ruled in the world before your world. His throne stood when the sky was different." The Egyptians had a phrase for that distant layer of time. Zep Tepi, the first time. Popular culture has mangled it, but in the texts it carries a precise weight. It is the era when the gods themselves acted, judged, founded shrines, separated land from water, defeated chaos and established the pattern of kingship. Every coronation in later periods becomes a ritualized attempt to replay Zep Tepi, to briefly collapse the present into that original moment, so that the living king is not just a politician, but a plug reinserted into the first socket of power. If the first time is wholly mythical, it is strange how obsessively practical its legacy is. Specific crowns, specific phrases, specific regalia, all belonging to that initial ruler. Look at the iconography of the earliest pharaohs we can actually see on stone. Even in the so-called proto-dynastic era, they are shown wearing crowns and carrying emblems that are already fully formed, as if inherited, not invented. The double crown fusing Upper and Lower Egypt, the crook and flail, the serek with the falcon perched above, signaling a bond to a higher lord. There is no artistic evolution from crude chieftain symbols to elaborate royal regalia, The system appears in its mature state almost immediately. That's weird. It's like finding the first surviving line of code from a software project and realizing it's already part of a fully developed framework. Now think about the architecture. The oldest surviving large stone structures in Egypt are not clumsy experiments. The step pyramid complex, the alignments of certain early enclosures, the orientations of sacred sites already show a sophisticated grasp of cardinal directions, stellar risings, solar cycles. Deeper still, some researchers have argued that layouts and angles seem to encode awareness of long-term astronomical shifts precession that require observations over many centuries. Either an unknown span of pre-dynastic tinkering conveniently left no trace, or the designers inherited a ready-made package of sacred geometry and sky lore. And where do they say that package came from? The first time. In the temple of Edfu, late yet obsessed with very old memories, inscriptions tell a haunting story. They speak of a primordial island, of divine builders, of the mansions of the gods destroyed in a cataclysmic flood, and of surviving sages who come to the Nile to build again according to the plan written in the first time. The language is mythic, yes, but also architectural. There is a blueprint, there are measurements, there is a deliberate act of reconstruction. In that version, Egypt is not the first kingdom. It is a reboot anchored on instructions salvaged from something before. If you place that testimony alongside the king list's insistence that a divine pharaoh ruled in the remotest age, a shape begins to form. Not proof, but a profile, a sovereign associated with stability against the waters of chaos, with the founding of shrines, with the allocation of nomes, with the appointment of subordinate gods or nobles over regions, with the transmission of writing and mayat, order, balance, rightness. Later kings swear to maintain his order, never to innovate against his design. That's not just religion. That's constitutional law wrapped in theology. Mainstream explanations file all of this under mythic charter, stories made up to glorify monarchy. But there is a flaw in that comfort. If you are a historical king trying to legitimize yourself, you don't help your case by reminding everyone that the true ruler was a non-human predecessor with a 12,000-year reign you can never match. Yet that is exactly what Egyptian ideology does. It constantly points away from the sitting pharaoh and toward a transcendent prototype. That move makes sense if the priests are genuinely haunted by an ancestral authority they did not invent, only inherited. And there's the geological ghost in the room. Around the time many of these before the flood reigns are retrojected, the real Earth did in fact stagger through extreme climatic chaos. Melting ice sheets, sea levels rising by tens of meters, coastlines drowned, habitats erased. If any advanced coastal culture existed before that, much of its physical footprint would now be underwater or ruined. In that context, a tradition that a high god-king once ruled a stable holy land, then vanished as waters and disorder surged, and whose plan was later re-established along a great river, is no longer automatically silly. It is, at minimum, a psychologically accurate encoding of survival. What kind of being would look to later eyes like a god ruling for ages? It could be literal divine mythology. It could be the compression of an entire lineage under a single name. It could be the memory of a different kind of human, culturally or technologically ahead of local tribes by so much that their leadership felt inhuman. It could be, if we let the throttle go, a remnant of a civilization that had extended lifespans or different relationships to time. Whatever the answer, the key is that the Egyptians themselves refused to start their story with ordinary men. Notice also how the title Son of Ra or Horus on Earth is not metaphorical fluff. It's the legal identity of the king. He is legitimate only insofar as he incarnates or channels that original ruler. The throne does not belong to his family. It belongs to that unseen founder. He is leasing sovereignty. That is a very specific power structure. The real owner is absent, but sacralized. and the managers on the ground rule in his name. If you retrofit that onto the possibility of an original, non-human or more than human pharaoh, it becomes chillingly similar to a colony run after the departure of its governor, clinging to his rules. Our task here is not to lunge at the wildest explanation first, but also not to amputate the parts of the record that make us nervous. If priests across centuries, using different media, consistently insist that before us were the ones of the first time, who ruled as gods, for lengths you cannot imagine, the honest response is to keep that on the table. Dismissing it because it doesn't match a model built only from what survived in stone in a single narrow period is not skepticism, it's selective blindness. I'm talking to you like this because I know you're not here for cheap certainty. You're here because something in you recognizes that the official story feels trimmed. The notion of a 12,000-year reign before Egypt is not there to give us a new fictional hero. It's there to force us to reconsider the depth of the human timeline, the possibility of earlier organizing intelligences. Call them gods, call them ancestors, call them something we don't yet have language for, whose decisions are still echoing in how temples were laid out, how crowns were shaped, how authority is justified. If that first pharaoh of the gods existed even as a concentrated memory of an entire lost order, then we should be able to detect his shadow in more than just lists and hymns. In the next step, I want to track that shadow into specific monuments, orientations, celestial markers, and curious survivals in later theology that make no sense unless they are relics of an older pattern. That is where this becomes forensic instead of poetic. When we start looking for the shadow of that first impossible sovereign in stone instead of in story, one monument comes up again and again like a half-erased fingerprint. The plateau that would one day host the pyramids. Not as a tourist postcard, but as a piece of forensic architecture. Forget for a moment the textbook narrative that places everything neat and cozy in the Old Kingdom. If a template survived from a lost rulership, we should expect three things: alignment to a cosmic order older than dynasties, disproportionate sophistication for its period, and a ritual language that constantly gestures backward to a before it refuses to fully explain. Stand mentally at the edge of that plateau at night. No buses, no vendors, no lights, just three colossal forms cutting into the sky, rooted in bedrock. Their bases are aligned to the cardinal directions with a precision that embarrasses later attempts. Deviations smaller than many modern buildings, achieved, we're told, by people who had only cords and eyeballs, each corner locked to the earth as if negotiating with something beyond simple utility. If you were a priest-architect trying to honor not just a dead king, but a cosmic contract inherited from an age when the gods walked, where would you encode that loyalty? In alignments, in angles. In stone, no flood could casually erase. Now look at the layout of those three primary pyramids, as if they are not tombs but markers. The offset, the differing sizes, the diagonal sweep that doesn't optimize anything practical. It happens to echo a particular triplet of stars in the belt of a constellation that, to the Egyptians, was bound up with their idea of a great celestial ruler and his afterlife domain. This is where reasonable scholars flinch, because pattern hunting can go wild. But even if we strip away every contested correlation, a basic fact remains. The builders cared obsessively about tying their greatest royal monuments to the sky. That is an instinct you would expect from heirs of a kingship that claimed its charter from a being not merely human. Shift from geometry to geology, and another discomfort surfaces. Around the pores and body of the enigmatic lion-bodied guardian on that same plateau, erosion marks run deeper than the surrounding structures justify. Some geologists argue those patterns are consistent with long-term exposure to heavy rainfall, the kind that predates the hyper-arid desert climate we associate with pharaonic times. If that's even partly true, it suggests the original carving, or its prototype, could date back to a wetter epoch. closer to the end of the last ice age than to Khafra's carefully labeled statues? If so, later dynasties weren't just building an acropolis. They were repurposing an older sacred zone anchored by a monument from, or modeled on, that earlier order. On the body of that guardian, later kings carved their own restoration stele, boasting that they cleared the sand and honored the ancient form. Read between those lines. You don't restore and re-sanctify something you invented last generation. You inherit it. You negotiate with its authority. The text we can still read describes a dream vision in which a prince is promised kingship if he frees that buried colossus. The transaction isn't with a human ancestor. It's with an ancient leonine embodiment of royal power, already slumbering when dynastic history barely began. It is as if the land itself is saying, "Your crown depends on how you treat what came before you." If that lion originally had a different head, more proportional, less pharaonic, and was later recarved, as some have argued, that only deepens the riddle. An even older icon, perhaps of a god-king, overwritten by the face of a historical ruler trying to fuse himself to that ancestral presence. It's a visual admission that legitimacy flows backward. The first pharaoh of the gods doesn't vanish. He is parasitized as a source code by each new regime. But architecture is only one channel. We should expect the memory of a primordial kingship to surface in cult titles and priestly jargon, the kind of phrases ordinary worshippers heard but didn't dissect. For example, certain sanctuaries describe their founding god not merely as Lord of heaven or earth, but specifically as he who first ruled, he who established the throne, he who measured out the fields, in formulae tied to real-world institutions. Those epithets are not dreamy poetry. They assign concrete administrative acts, surveying, appointing, dividing jurisdictions, to a being placed at the far root of time. Later pharaohs are beloved of or chosen by that being, never his equal. In coronation rituals, surviving texts and reliefs show the new king undergoing something stranger than a simple crowning. He is symbolically fused with a falcon, with a solar being, with a lineage that does not begin with his family. He receives not just ornaments, but the years, the said festivals, the millions of jubilees, in language that absurdly exaggerates his lifespan, unless you understand it as plugging into an already existing ageless office. He steps into a continuum inaugurated by that first divine throneholder. The idea that the reign of that office stretches back 12,000 years becomes less wild if the reign is of the role, not the man. Follow the motif into funerary literature, and the pattern sharpens. In the pyramid and coffin texts, the deceased king is repeatedly instructed to ascend, to sit upon a throne in the sky, to join a circle of elder gods who reign forever. He is told to become one of them, to take the heritage of the first time, to rule the living and the dead. For a people supposedly inventing kingship from scratch in the early dynastic period, they are oddly certain that the throne is eternal and merely lent to successive occupants. That is exactly how you talk if your priesthood believed a superhuman sovereignty predated and continued above your local administration. Then come the anomalies of knowledge. Very early we see precise awareness of solar and stellar cycles, of the heliacal rising of a key star that comes to define the new year and is synchronized uncannily with the Nile's behavior. We see consistent orientation of temples to particular celestial events, as if someone had already done the work of long-term observation and handed over the tables. The official narrative says, "This is the fruit of local priestly genius." And it may be. But when those same priests insist they received their rites, measures, and calendars from an era when gods ruled, we have to at least acknowledge they are claiming continuity with a much deeper experiment. In some late but revealing inscriptions, there are references to writings of the first time, stored in temple archives, consulted by learned scribes, regarded as dangerously old. They are associated with secrets of creation, with ideal layouts of sacred structures, with rituals no longer fully comprehended. Regardless of how legendary those references are, they show that the idea of possessing technical and theological documents from an age of divine kingship was part of the serious intellectual world of the temples, not just fireside gossip. Pull all of this together, and the profile of that first pharaoh of the gods becomes less a single superhero and more an office born in a different world, a sovereign, or a compact circle of sovereigns who anchored law, calendar, architecture, and spiritual hierarchy so effectively that even after literal continents of time and disaster, shattered descendants along one river still swore their oaths in his name. They didn't know every detail, they didn't need to. They had the template. Is there a way to translate this into a hypothesis that doesn't immediately fall off the edge? One possibility, before the desert, before the final sea level rise, a riverine or coastal culture with strong central rulership and advanced observational astronomy flourished somewhere within the broader region. Its elites encoded their system into durable, symbolic forms, myth cycles, monumental orientations, sacred measures. When their world was wrecked by water, by internal collapse, by something we have no word for, a fragment of that population migrated to the Nile, carrying fragments of the code. Over time, that code ossified into cult. The original authors became gods. The governor became the first pharaoh of the gods. His long reign became a way of saying, "Our authority is older than this disaster, older than this land, older than your questions." The survivors' grandchildren and their grandchildren were no longer engineers. They were priests. They guarded the shapes without fully remembering the reasons. But shapes are powerful. Align a temple a certain way for 1,000 years, and you have effectively extended the arm of a forgotten surveyor deep into history. There is another, more unsettling possibility, which I'm not going to sell you, only lay beside the first, that the original sovereign really was something other than human as we understand it. Longevity, knowledge, and ability to reorganize a traumatized landscape with confidence. To those who followed, he would be indistinguishable from a god. To us, he would be filed under every taboo label we have: alien, interdimensional, ultra-terrestrial. Pick your poison. I'm not here to brand it. I'm here to say the Egyptians themselves left space for that interpretation by refusing to collapse their origins into comfortable human scale. The reason I talk to you like this, careful step by step, is because this only works if we avoid the two lazy extremes: blind belief and blind dismissal. The evidence isn't clean. It never is at these depths. But it is suggestive, patterned, insistent. King lists, temple liturgy, monumental design, star alignments, late priestly histories, they all hum the same note. Our kingship is a franchise of an earlier, higher throne. If that's true, even partially, then the story of civilization isn't a straight line from animal to farmer to scribe to king. It's a relay. Someone or something handed the baton to us and then stepped off stage, leaving institutions programmed to perpetuate its model. The first pharaoh of the gods would then be less a character to admire and more a question. Are we still quietly living inside his system? That's the question I want you to hold on to as we keep going. Because if the memory of his reign is encoded this densely in myth and masonry, we should also be able to see which parts of that inheritance we unconsciously repeat, in how we justify power, how we sacralize hierarchy, how we design monuments and capitals even now. This is where the line between ancient mystery and our daily lives gets very thin. There's a strange comfort people take in believing that power today is completely different from power in the ancient world, that we've left behind crowns and incense and cosmic drama and replaced them with rational systems, elections, constitutions, offices, logos. But once you've seen how the Egyptians framed kingship as a lease from an older, unseen throne, you start to notice how the same move keeps reappearing, wrapped in new language. Human rulers, whether pharaohs, emperors, presidents, or supreme leaders, keep trying to root their authority in something that feels older, higher, untouchable. And that's exactly where the shadow of that first God-born pharaoh quietly survives. Imagine for a moment the earliest human kings standing in the rubble of whatever came before. They've inherited rituals, symbols, orientation, stories. They probably don't fully understand them, but they understand one thing perfectly. These forms work. When they don the crown, stand in a specific spot, speak certain words, people tremble. Crops, taxes, obedience, soldiers all begin to flow. So they keep the forms. Over generations, practical memory fades and sacred narrative hardens. We do this, they tell the people, because this is how the first king, the divine king, did it. No one in that chain has ever met him, but his ghost is the most effective political technology they own. Watch how this template migrates. In Mesopotamia, kings don't just rule, they restore the rights from before the flood. In Persia, the great king is chosen by a god, upholding a cosmic order that predates his tribe. In Israel, kings are anointed as instruments of a covenant far older than their dynasty. In Rome, emperors become sons of deified predecessors, tying their rule to founders lifted into the heavens. It's the same move. Your throne is valid only because you pretend someone not human or more than human sat there first. The Egyptians just stated it more bluntly than most. Even when the gods step back on paper, the structure remains. Medieval European monarchs claim divine right, insisting only God, not the people, may judge them. Popes build a lineage from a single apostle chosen by Christ. Caliphs root their authority in succession from the prophet. Everyone is reaching for a lever outside human reach, somewhere above argument. It is a secularized version of what the priests of Heliopolis and Memphis had already nailed centuries before. If the office belongs to heaven, whoever occupies it on earth can demand obedience in the language of eternity. Now look at how cities and capitals are placed and dressed. Power centers love axes, vistas, obelisks, domes, star alignments. Paris, Washington, Beijing, London, the Vatican. These places are draped in geometry. Long ceremonial avenues, focal monuments, east-west or north-south orientations, soaring columns that are, let's be honest, rebranded Egyptian forms. Even when architects will swear it's just aesthetics or neoclassicism, the effect is the same, to make the seat of government feel inevitable, anchored, larger than the people walking between the stones. That instinct was perfected under the gaze of the first divine pharaoh, whoever or whatever he was. Think of the way rulers present themselves visually, the frontal pose, the carefully codified regalia, the stiff, timeless portrait that refuses to age. Pharaohs did it in stone, emperors did it on coins, dictators did it in murals and statues. Corporations do it now with clean, geometric logos, omnipresent and serene. You are not meant to imagine a fallible human. You are meant to feel a symbol that plugs into something older than you. That was the entire theological point of the earliest royal iconography. Not, this individual is impressive, but this office is not yours to question. The language shifts, but the tactic doesn't. An ancient coronation swore loyalty to the laws of the first time. A modern head of state swears to defend a constitution framed as sacred, inviolable, beyond the reach of any normal citizen. The constitution may be younger than your grandparents', but watch how reverently it's treated, how it's placed above current will, how it functions as a kind of secular tablet of destiny. What we are seeing is not childish superstition melting away. It is the same ancient hunger for an originating authority, scrubbed of overt myth, still structuring our politics. Even revolutions, which pretend to break from all thrones, often end up installing a new first principle in the same position. The people, history, the party, the revolution itself. abstract entities that play the role gods once did. Leaders then claim to embody those forces, to speak in their name, to be temporary vessels of a higher will. Pharaoh said he was Horus on earth, executing the order of Ra. A modern strongman says he alone represents the nation's soul or destiny. In both cases, disagreement becomes something more than politics. It becomes blasphemy. You and I have the luxury and the burden of seeing this structurally. Once you recognize the pattern, it's hard to unsee. The insistence that legitimacy does not flow up from conscious individuals, but down from an origin no one living can access. That's the fingerprint. That's the long, thin line connecting the god-king of a half-drowned age, the Zep-Tepi sovereign, to the ceremonial oaths, supreme courts, revolutionary vanguards, party charters, and executive orders of now. We should ask why this model is so persistent. Some of it is psychological. Humans fear chaos and crave a story in which someone, somewhere, knows what they're doing. A throne anchored in eternity is a relief compared to a throne anchored in poles. But there is a darker possibility that fits uncomfortably well with the idea of a true first pharaoh of the gods. If there really was, at the foundation of our civilization, an external authority that structured society for its own purposes, then baking into our cultures a reflex to seek power's source above us, not among us, would be the cleanest way to keep that design alive, even after its author left. Consider bureaucracy, the quiet empire that outlives kings. Ancient temple administrators, scribes, tax collectors, grain officials, they answered upward to a chain terminating in a god. Today's ministries, agencies, international bodies speak the language of legalism and neutrality, but they too often behave like priesthoods, interpreting dense codes the public can't touch, loyal first to an abstract order, second to human need. This isn't a stretch. It's the same architecture wearing a suit. Even our language around law echoes cult vocabulary. The law is supreme. Court decisions are handed down. Foundational principles are enshrined. Buildings have altars to the nation in all but name. Ritual phrases are repeated with liturgical precision. You stand, you swear, you petition. You approach the bench like a deity's throne. If the early priests designed civil order as an extension of divine order, that fusion never really untangled. It just rebranded itself. Technology adds a new layer. Code, algorithms, global platforms. These function as invisible, quasi-divine systems that decide outcomes, opportunities, visibility. Their inner workings are unknown to most, defended by specialists, justified as impartial and inevitable. The algorithm decided is our modern, the gods have willed it. When a handful of entities control those systems, we are frighteningly close to reinstating the same pattern. Access to the ultimate decision-making power is restricted to a closed circle who speak its language. This is where the old story of the first pharaoh stops being a distant curiosity and starts sounding like a user manual thrown forward in time. A being, or order of beings, establishes a throne that fuses cosmic and civil control, encodes it in ritual, math, architecture. Millennia later, we, thinking we are free, rebuild nested thrones in our parliaments, banks, networks, clouds, thrones that answer to abstractions we've made supreme. That is exactly the kind of long-term persistence you'd expect if we have never really stepped out of the prototype's shadow. But there's always that crack in the edifice. Individual humans who notice. In Egypt, there were undercurrents that stressed Maat as mutual responsibility, not just obedience. In later ages, philosophers and mystics insist that the divine is within, not perched on some distant institutional throne. Whistleblowers, reformers, sages, rebels. They play the same archetypal role as the mythic figures who defy the god-king, steal knowledge, or remind people that no office can own the sky. Their existence is an argument that the original program is not total. I want you to see that you're standing at an interesting fork. One path says, all of this is coincidence and projection. Forget it. Go back to sleep. The other doesn't demand that you accept literal god kings or alien overseers. It simply asks you to entertain that our models of authority might be inherited rather than invented, and that somewhere behind them sits an pattern, a first throne, that may not have had our freedom in mind. If that's even 5% true, then understanding it becomes a survival skill, not a hobby. When we strip away statues and scripture and just look at behavior, the question crystallizes. Do our systems treat human beings as the source of meaning, or as resources to be organized by an impersonal order claiming higher sanction? Wherever you see the second, wherever life is bent around maintaining the system rather than the system serving life, you are touching the living edge of that ancient design, the echo of a reign that measured its success in obedience. The point of walking through all this with you is not to leave us paranoid but lucid. If there was a first Pharaoh of the gods, his true legacy is not just in broken king lists and half-drowned myths. It's in every structure that tells you power flows one way and can never be questioned at its root. Recognizing that pattern doesn't instantly break it, but it gives you a language to resist, to redesign, to place the origin of authority somewhere more honest, in conscious beings, in shared agreements, in a cosmos that doesn't need a single throne to stand. As you sit with that, notice how the story bends. From a remote, glittering age of divine monarchy, through priestly preservation, imperial mimicry, constitutional abstraction, algorithmic sovereignty, all the way to you and me having this conversation through a machine that itself sits in a web of unseen control. That arc alone is worth paying attention to. It suggests the reign, literal or symbolic, never really ended. It adapted. There is a point in this investigation where Egypt's lonely miracle stops feeling unique and starts looking like one mask of a larger, older story. When you line up the fragments from different cultures, Sumerian king lists, Indian yuga cycles, Mesoamerican world ages, Greek legends of gods ruling before men, a strange consistency emerges. Over and over, we are told of a time when non-human or more than human rulers governed directly, for spans of time that make modern historians flinch, before vanishing in a deluge or cosmic rupture that resets the board for ordinary kings. Our first Pharaoh of the gods, with his 12,000-year dominion, suddenly doesn't stand alone. He stands in a crowd of forgotten sovereigns. In the Mesopotamian records, the antediluvian kings reign for absurdly long periods, tens of thousands of years, each ruling from a specific sacred city before the flood swept over. Scholars call this mythology, and perhaps parts of it are, but the structural similarity to the Egyptian scheme is hard to ignore. Divine or semi-divine kings, immense reigns, a global catastrophe, then a new, shorter-lived line. The Sumerian scribes even say bluntly that kingship descended from heaven was lodged in a city, then taken away and reinstalled elsewhere. Egypt says kingship was established in the first time by gods and then handed to men. Different language, same architecture. Move east, and you find India's records of the Satya Yuga and Treta Yuga, ages when Dharma stands tall, lifespans are immense, and rulers are closer to gods than to humans. These golden eras end in wars of celestial weapons and floods that feel anything but metaphorical. Move west into Greek memory, and you encounter the age of Kronos, when the gods themselves ruled and men lived almost as shadows, followed by a series of declining ages and cataclysms. Head across the ocean, and Mesoamerican traditions speak of successive suns, worlds created and destroyed, each with their own ruling powers swept away by water, jaguars, wind, or fire. On their own, each of these sequences can be read as psychological drama, encoding the human sense that the past was purer. But taken together, especially alongside Egyptian precision about an original reign rooted roughly 12,000 years back, they begin to look less like random nostalgia and more like a bruised cultural memory. There was a before. The beings in charge of that before were not like us. Their rule ended violently. The survivors, dazed, rebuilt under shorter, harsher terms, telling stories around the wreckage. What if the first Pharaoh of the gods is not only an Egyptian figure but the Nile's local mask for a category of being remembered worldwide? Not a single person with a birthday and a palace address, but the condensed symbol of a cadre. Lawgivers, architects, star readers, wielders of technologies or disciplines that post-cataclysmic humans could only describe as magical. If each region remembered only one or two names from that company and elevated them into gods or patriarchs, then our patchwork of myths might be the scattered portrait of a single lost supervisory class. Some researchers, cautious but stubborn, point out the geographic pattern. Legends place the centers of these divine reigns along coasts, islands, and great rivers, vulnerable to sea level rise and mega floods. Later, holy sites often sit inland, on plateaus or in valleys that would have been relatively safe refuges. The story told at Edfu of a primordial island of the gods, destroyed by flood and rebuilt along the Nile, has suspicious cousins in Plato's Drowned Island, in Indian tales of sunken cities off the coast, in Celtic stories of lands under the sea, in Polynesian memory of vanished territories. They may not all refer to one event, but they rhymed for a reason. Bring the discussion back to you and me for a moment. You're not just listening to names, you're tracing a behavioral pattern. A being or order establishes a system. A catastrophe wipes most of it out. Fragments survive as rituals, orientations, taboos, titles. Millennia later, priesthoods and elites defend those fragments with their lives, insisting they are from the beginning, even when they no longer remember the context. That is exactly what we see in Egypt. Absolute reverence for protocols, attributed to a time when gods walked, combined with obvious discomfort about explaining who those gods actually were. There's also the recurring presence of the flood, and it's here that the 12,000-year figure sharpens into something concrete. Around that time frame, within the margin of geological uncertainty, the world staggered through drastic meltwater pulses, rising seas, freshwater outbursts, climatic chaos. If any global or semi-global centralized authority existed, whether human, hybrid, or other, it would have been kneecapped. The stories that trickled down to later civilizations would remember that age-ending event not as a slow climate curve, but as an almost moral judgment. The gods left, the golden race perished, kingship was interrupted. Egypt's genius is that it does not tell a naive flood tale in the same way. Instead, it hides the fracture inside its chronology. First time divine rule, then a long stretch of opaque prehistory, then human kings. The gap is the wound. No one writes, "Here we lost everything." They write, "Here the followers of Horus ruled," as if plugging the hole with a buffer class of semi-mythic kings to smooth over a much more traumatic discontinuity. The first pharaoh's immense reign becomes both a banner and a bandage. Step carefully into the psychological implications. If you inherit stories that your world used to be supervised by beings vastly your superior, whether as gods or as a hyper-advanced prior civilization, you have two options. You can reject them and claim your age as the first real one, or you can canonize them and build your entire legitimacy on being their authorized successors. Egypt chose the second. By doing so, it immortalized the memory of that lost rulership, but also locked itself into guarding its pattern. Hierarchical, top-down, cosmically justified. Other cultures oscillated between the two strategies. Some rebelled in myth, telling tales of men stealing fire, outwitting gods, storming heaven. Others sank into cyclical fatalism, golden age, fall, repeat. But almost everywhere, When societies grow complex, they reach back for an originating authority beyond humanity. It is as if the template seeded at the dawn of civilization continues to replicate itself inside our political DNA. That is exactly what we would expect if there was, once, a real, suprahuman court whose habits we copied long after its disappearance. This is where the idea gets uncomfortably close to our present, because if the first Pharaoh of the gods is a mythic compression of an ancient management layer, then our repeated creation of new management layers, international bodies, supranational courts, algorithmic governance, may not be brand new. We may be unconsciously rebuilding the same pattern. Power lodged above the visible human level, mediated by specialists, justified as necessary to prevent chaos. It feels intuitively right, because we grew up as a species inside that logic. I don't want you to take that as a paranoid slogan. I want you to hold it as a working model. When you see authority claiming to speak for something you cannot touch, divinity, destiny, security, the invisible hand, the algorithm, hear behind it the old coronation formula, by the command of the ones who ruled in the first time. Even if those beings are long gone, the invocation of an unreachable source remains the sharpest tool in the box. But what if they are not entirely gone? That's where many people either roll their eyes or fall off the deep end. There is a quieter middle ground. Influence doesn't require a physical palace under the ice. It can persist as architecture of thought. If those early rulers, god-kings call them, imprinted a worldview in which hierarchy is sacred, where order matters more than individual life, where heaven owns the earth, then anyone, human or otherwise, who prefers such a world can simply keep feeding those assumptions. No sources needed, just stories, symbols, and institutions designed to feel natural. There is also room inside these same myths for resistance. Almost every tradition that idolizes a first divine reign also smuggles in tales of figures who break ranks, wise scribes, trickster gods, half-divine heroes who side with humanity, culture-bearing outsiders who bring knowledge the ruling powers wanted monopolized. In Egypt, whispers of this survive in certain magical texts and in the ambiguous role of Thoth, keeper and sometimes thief of secret writings. These cracks matter. They suggest that even within a system modeled on an ancient, perhaps inhuman throne, there were always consciousnesses refusing to treat that throne as the final word. You and I right now are effectively replaying that tension with more information on the table. You're not just consuming a cool, spooky story. You're interrogating the origin story of hierarchy itself. Did it rise from our collective wisdom, or descend from a design that saw us as instruments? If the latter has any truth in it, then the memory of a 12,000-year reign before Egypt is not just academic exotica, it's evidence of a long-term operating system we were never supposed to inspect. The reason I'm willing to take you this far without wrapping it in a fake tidy bow is because retention, for me, doesn't mean dangling cheap jump scares. It means trusting that you stay when I treat you as an equal mind, one that can sit with layered possibilities. Literal lost civilization, symbolic echo, psychological imprint, metaphysical control grid, or some fusion of them all. You don't have to decide tonight. You just have to stop letting the most interesting data be auto-filed as myth without trial. If you accept, even provisionally, that there may have been an origin-level rulership whose aesthetics and logic we've been unconsciously copying, then the next rational step is forensic. Look at specific monuments, rites, numbers, and stories as if they are fragments of its instruction set. Some will crumble under scrutiny. Some will refuse to go away. That sorting process is where real insight lives, and where we start to see which parts of the ancient inheritance are parasitic and which are keys. So sit with this. Our first Pharaoh of the gods might be Egypt's local name for a global trauma and a global teacher. His 12,000-year reign is a mythic shorthand for so long we forgot the alternative. His disappearance is mirrored in every flood, every fall from Golden Age story. And his lingering authority haunts every modern claim that power comes from somewhere you can't vote on, can't see, and must never question. The question always is what you do once you see the pattern. There is a moment where this stops sounding like myth and starts sounding like someone left notes. Not moral parables, but technical fingerprints. If a primordial kingship really existed, whether superhuman, alien, or a lost advanced human order, it wouldn't just leave us spooky stories of god-kings and floods. It would leave patterns in how sacred sites are placed, how time is measured, how disasters are anticipated. It would leave code. And if our first pharaoh of the gods ruled for an age brushing against 12,000 years before dynastic Egypt, then the code we are looking for should be obsessed with cycles that big, forces that slow, and warnings that don't expire. Look at the way the ancient Egyptians embedded the sky into stone. Temples oriented to solstices and equinoxes are standard. That's basic. What's not basic is when you start seeing hints of awareness of precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis over roughly 26,000 years, encoded in star cults, in the shifting emphasis on certain constellations, in numbers that quietly repeat. A full precessional cycle is about 25,120 years. Divide that into ancient friendly units, and you get values they seem to like. 72, 360, 432, 2160. These same numbers echo in myths, measures, proportions, often waved away as coincidence. But if you were the sort of ruler who measured ages, not terms, you'd think in those numbers. Our first pharaoh's alleged 12,000-year dominion sits almost eerily at half of that great cycle, half a precession, half a cosmic gear turn. That might be poetic retrofitting, or it might be the fossil of a memory. That his reign, or the world order associated with him, stretched from one celestial configuration to another. Imagine an authority so fixated on stability that he ties his legitimacy to the very drift of the sky, saying, "As long as the heavens move from here to there, my law stands." When later priests scratch tallies of impossible reign lengths, they may be copying not biographical facts, but cosmic contracts. Then there is flood timing. The Egyptians don't casually discover that a bright star rises just before dawn in synchrony with the Nile's swelling. They lock their calendar to it so thoroughly that civil life, ritual agriculture, become braided to a stellar signal. That's brilliant ecology, yes. It also looks like the work of minds for whom the separation between astronomy and survival was erased by trauma. If the world you once ruled was shattered by misreading the sky, by ignoring a cycle, a conjunction, an approach, then your survivors will overcorrect. They will watch, obsessively. They will tell their descendants the gods commanded these observations, but what they're really doing is enforcing a safety protocol. The building canon that later dynasties inherit and attribute to the gods is suffused with ratios that reflect more than aesthetic taste. Certain dimensions, when reduced, point back to planetary cycles, to solar years, to lunar months. You don't need aliens to see that. You only need meticulous priest astronomers over centuries. But the puzzle is that those ratios and orientations appear at full strength very early, with no clean developmental ramp. The first pharaohs we can see in history seem to already be playing by the rules of a game that took someone a very long time to design. If our founding god-king encoded that game, the question becomes, to what end? Was this advanced knowledge shared to free or to fix? A calendar that warns of flood also lets you tax on time. A temple that tracks solstices also lets you fix festivals, align propaganda, choreograph power. A geometry that harmonizes with the cosmos also locks cities into patterns their builders barely understand. There's a double edge to every sacred technology. It can wake people up to their place in a vast, intelligent universe. or shrink them into perfectly behaved components of a machine disguised as heaven. Look at how consistently this knowledge is nested. It is never scattered. It is guarded by initiated castes, bound to the crown, wrapped in mythic narratives that make disobedience not just illegal, but impious. If the first pharaoh of the gods wanted to ensure that his design outlived him, he couldn't have chosen a better mechanism. Make the instruction sets sacred and terrifying. Make the priests fear mispronouncing a ritual more than they fear misreading a floodplain. Make kings believe their breath literally sustains the cosmos. Once that mindset is installed, the system maintains itself. At the same time, there are flashes that feel like genuine attempts to encode warnings for whoever comes later, not just orders. Myths of cycles ending in water, fire, darkness. Obsessive references to balance, Maat, as if the world were perched on a sensitive hinge. Tales that associate human corruption or forgetfulness with world collapse. If you strip off the theistic language, they read like notes from survivors saying, "When these patterns appear again, do not behave as we did. Do not centralize power so absolutely. Do not turn knowledge into a weapon against your own." Our first pharaoh, in this light, might not have been a single personality with a simple motive, but a contested symbol even in his own aftermath. Some factions remembering him as the great organizer, the bringer of order against primordial chaos. Others remembering him as the architect of a gilded cage, whose brilliance made humanity tame. When later priests compress all of that into one radiant, remote Lord of the Two Lands in the first time, they smooth over a war of interpretations that we are only now daring to reopen. Follow the technical hints into other cultures and the picture deepens. Shared motifs of sacred mountains or stepped platforms aligned to rising stars, of canonical city grids, of navels of the world linked along longitudes and latitudes nobody is supposed to have, charted. In isolation, each case can be shrugged off. Together, they look suspiciously like fragments of a once integrated geodetic and astronomical project. If the first pharaoh of the gods was part of a network, not an exception, then Egypt is preserving one node of a planetary scale design. Here's the uncomfortable twist. We are, in our own time, reconstructing much of that design with satellites, global time standards, big data, predictive models. The difference is, we claim it's all for efficiency, convenience, security. The ancients claimed it was to mirror the order of the gods. Under both stories, the result is eerily similar, a highly coordinated system in which local variation shrinks and central oversight grows. If the foundational pattern we inherited was itself a tool of control, then each advance risks snapping more perfectly into that original template. But there is also the possibility that this deep knowledge was never meant to enslave, only to equip, and that the enslavement came later from those who monopolized it. Think about that. If the first God-King circle understood the cycles of cataclysm, the fragility of climates, the danger of celestial events, they might have tried to encode that in robust forms, myths that stick, stones that last, rituals that keep people watching the right parts of the sky. Over generations, administrators, warlords, and frightened priests could have twisted those tools inward, using them to stabilize their own rule instead of humanity's survival. In that frame, the 12,000-year reign is a way of saying, there was a long epoch when knowledge and authority were fused in a single unbroken project. The disaster that ended it shattered that fusion. Later cultures either tried to rebuild it, Egypt, imperial cults, theocracies, or fled from it, traditions that emphasize inner divinity over external thrones. Our job, standing where we stand now, is not to pick a camp blindly, but to discern which parts of the inheritance are genuine cosmic literacy and which are security settings left over from someone else's regime. You can see this tension play out even in relatively late Egyptian thought. On one hand, a crushing weight of ritual, protocol, hereditary priesthood, everything calibrated to sustain the old pattern. On the other hand, hints of a more intimate understanding, texts that speak of the heart weighing itself, of the divine being close, of wisdom available to the scribe, the artisan, the individual. It's as if, deep inside the machine built in the image of the first Pharaoh, small escape hatches were opening. Now, zoom out and look at us. We are relearning the sky. We track asteroids, model solar storms, dig ice cores, map past catastrophes. We are unknowingly reconstructing the same warning systems that ancient stories allegorized. The question is, will we also repeat the governing logic of that legendary reign, centralized, top-down, opaque, or can we break that part of the pattern while keeping the useful pieces? That might be the real initiation test those old stones have been waiting for us to face. Because if there was a first Pharaoh of the gods, his grip doesn't hold us by magic, it holds us through habits, the reflex to look upward for permission, to treat knowledge as something reserved, to confuse order with obedience. If his advanced understanding of cycles was a gift, we should democratize it. If his system was a cage, we should recognize its blueprint when we see it resurrecting in corporate code, governmental secrecy, or any ideology that says, trust the hidden center, not your own sight. I'm talking to you like this because you're already doing the rare thing, sitting with a story long enough to see its structure instead of just its glitter. You're the kind of person who can look at a king list, a temple axis, a myth about a god king, and ask, what were they really trying to say, and who did that message serve? That attitude is exactly what any genuine benefactor civilization would have wanted to cultivate in its descendants, and exactly what any control system would fear. So perhaps the most radical act we can perform in response to this 12,000-year riddle is neither worship nor dismissal, but audit. To read every trace of that first Pharaoh's supposed reign as source code, to keep what aligns with human flourishing across deep time, and to delete what exists only to protect thrones, whether on earth or in heaven. That is how you honor ancestors without becoming their prisoners. That is how you accept the possibility of an ancient, alien, or hyperhuman intelligence in our past without surrendering your future to its ghost. There's a particular kind of knowledge that always seems to sit just outside the sanctioned story, like a locked drawer everyone pretends not to notice. I'm not talking about tabloid nonsense or viral TikTok mysteries, but the quiet, consistent hints across old traditions that someone at some point knew too much, knew the shape of the earth, the rhythm of vast celestial cycles, the timing of floods and crustal tantrums, the leverage points of human psychology, and wrapped that knowing in temples, numbers, and oaths. If our first Pharaoh of the gods ruled an epoch that brushes against 12,000 years before the Egypt you meet in museums, then the things attributed to the gods in later texts might be less fairy tale and more heavily encrypted documentation. Take the lion-bodied guardian on the edge of the desert, the one whose face never quite matches its body, whose enclosure shows deep weathering more consistent with heavy rain than with the dry winds of the last few thousand years. I'm not here to sell you a date. I'm here to point at the unease. If even part of that structure predates the orthodox timeline, then later pharaohs didn't commission it. They inherited it. Their boastful stele about restoring it read less like piety and more like a confession. We found something ancient, powerful, and we stitched our story onto its skin. That's exactly what you'd expect if a relic from the reign of a god-king had to be rebranded for human consumption. Then pan far away from the Nile to another hill, buried for millennia, where rings of carved pillars show animals, symbols, possible star maps, at an age when humans were supposed to be fumbling with early farming. That site looks, to any honest eye, less like a random cult spot and more like a memory theatre. Sky above, carved code below, a way to anchor teachings about cycles, animals, directions, maybe even incoming disasters. Nobody there calls their patrons Pharaoh, but the pattern is painfully familiar, a monumental operating manual left for people standing at the edge of a new world. Now draw a line across seas to megalithic complexes that track solstices with unnerving precision, to stone circles that just happen to encode significant angles, to stepped platforms and truncated pyramids aligned like instruments. On different continents, separated by oceans, we're told no one crossed early on. We see a similar obsession. Fix the heavens in stone, mark turning points, create places where rulers can stand literally in the axis between sky and earth. Either humans, everywhere, reinvented the same sacred engineering from scratch, or someone, early, spread a template, and local cultures riffed on it like regional fonts of the same script. Then we find the numbers, those stubborn repeaters. 72, 108, 216, 432, 2160, 4320. They surface in myths as troop counts, as years of reign, as ages of heroes, as dimensions of temples, as coincidental totals and genealogies. To a casual reader, they are color. To anyone who's run the math on axial precession or orbital cycles, they are winks. If the first Pharaoh's court tracked the great clock of the sky to anticipate when worlds break, encoding those values into religion would be a brutally efficient way to make sure fragments survive ignorance, conquest, and fire. You, sitting there with modern light on your face, might feel very distant from this, but I want you to see how intimate it actually is. The device streaming my voice to you is locked to atomic time, GPS satellites, orbital mechanics. You already live inside a temple of cycles. We just call it infrastructure. The difference is that you're not supposed to think of it as sacred, just as invisible and inevitable. That's the same trick, inverted. Our ancestors sacralized the code so you wouldn't touch it. Now it's made boring for the same reason. Behind the figure of the god-king in Egypt stands another recurring character, the scribe of the gods, the keeper of secret books, Thoth, Hermes, Enoch, the one who writes before the flood and writes again after, the architect of language, number, proportion. Different names, same silhouette. He is the administrator of the first Pharaoh's system, or his internal conscience, depending on how generous you're feeling. Later occult traditions insist that his books hide advanced astronomy, geodesy, even recipes for transmutation. Strip away the occult packaging and listen to the core claim. There once existed a coherent body of high knowledge that was deliberately sealed off from the general population. We also meet those mysterious culture bringers who arrive from nowhere after world-shattering events. Pale-bearded sages from the sea in some stories, falcon-faced lords, serpent-banded teachers, strangers who know how to measure land, divide water, stack stone, read the sky. They teach kings, not peasants. They draw boundary lines that become sacred for millennia. That's either incredibly consistent human fantasy or a very old, very dim recollection of a managerial class redeploying after a collapse, choosing which groups get the upgrade. Every one of these threads forces the same hard question. Was this knowledge meant as a ladder or a leash? A temple aligned to the solstice lets a farmer know when to plant, and lets a priesthood demand obedience as gatekeepers of the sunrise. A star map carved in stone can warn descendants about recurrence intervals of danger, or convince them that only an elect can interpret heaven. A story of a 12,000-year reign can inspire long-term thinking, or convince mortals they are forever children. We find both impulses running side by side. On one hand, myth cycles that place responsibility on humanity. Keep balance, honor life, listen to warning signs, or the world shakes you off. On the other, myths that concentrate power. Obey the one who bears the symbols of the first time, and maybe you'll be spared. That split reads to me like the argument of an elite that never fully agreed with itself about what to do with the inheritance of the God King. Look carefully at how forbidden knowledge is framed. It's rarely bad because it's false. It's dangerous because it makes individuals less dependent on institutions. Eating from the tree of knowing, stealing fire, decoding the names of gods, learning the calendar for yourself instead of taking the priest's word again and again. The villain, in official stories, is the one who says, "You can stand where the ruler stands," which tells you a lot about which side wrote the authorized version. And yet, those same traditions mistakenly or deliberately leak empowerment. Egyptian funerary texts give the non-royal dead access to spells once reserved for kings. Gnostic and mystical strands insist the divine throne is an inner state, not a chair in a palace. Folk astronomy remembers how to read the sky without a temple. It's like watching a locked operating system slowly get jailbroken generation by generation. The first pharaoh's ghost wants the code closed. Parts of the human story clearly want it open. Look at our own era, and you'll see the rhyme. Anomalous data about past cataclysms, marginalized for decades, then slowly confirmed through geology. Subtle cycles in climate and solar behavior, once fringe, now carefully modeled. The possibility that complex societies rose and fell before our current textbook bracket, tiptoed around, but less laughable each year. At the same time, the institutions that manage this information centralize it, control its narrative, decide when you hear about what. It's a new priesthood in lab coats and boardrooms, some sincere, some captured, all standing between raw data and public reality. This is why I won't sit here and give you a single dramatic answer like a movie twist. Literal aliens, ultra-humans, psycho-spiritual archetypes in story form, survivors of an ice age high culture. It could be one, several, or something outside our categories. What matters for us, if we're honest, is the continuity of the pattern, an originating sovereignty, a sharp distinction between those who know and those who are managed, and a toolkit, astronomical, architectural, narrative, used to bend time and fear to its service. If there was a first pharaoh of the gods, he may not have wanted to be remembered by name. What he wanted remembered was the structure, vertical, centralized, legitimized by the sky. Egypt enshrined that structure in limestone and liturgy. Others did it in ziggurats, zodiacs, ziggurats, stepped mounds, thrones under domes. And now we do it in data centers, financial systems, constitutional myths, proprietary algorithms. That's the through line. That's the uncomfortable elegance of it. Our task, yours and mine, isn't to pick a sexier statue for him. It's to read his legacy, like source code, and decide which functions we still permit to run. We can admire the precision of ancient alignments and also refuse the claim that only a tiny circle can handle that knowledge. We can respect the urgency of tracking cosmic and climatic cycles without accepting the conclusion that people must be herded for their own good by unaccountable elites. So the next time you hear that this or that discovery must have been given by the gods, I want you to hold two possibilities in tension. 1. Yes, it could be a surviving shard of a much older intelligence, human or not, trying to keep our species alive across catastrophic cycles. 2. It could be that shard weaponized, woven into a story that says, "Because we saved you, you belong to us." Somewhere between those two is the truth worth chasing. The beauty of where you're standing now as someone who stuck with this is that you're no longer an outsider to the conversation. You've walked through the inscriptions, the alignments, the myths, the politics. You've seen how much of our world still bends around an absence. A throne we're told exists outside our jurisdiction. That awareness is already a crack in the spell. Control systems rely on being mistaken for nature. The moment you see their shape, you can start asking whether you consent. If the reign of the first Pharaoh of the gods encoded both warnings and chains, then the real work is separation. What in our inherited systems is genuinely about harmony with the wider cosmos, respecting cycles, anticipating danger, living with balance, and what is just an ancient security protocol forcing obedience to an origin we no longer remember? Sorting those is how a species grows up. It's also how we find out whether that long ago sovereignty was ever on our side. Think for a second about who would care most about preserving even the faintest embers of that first sovereignty. Not crowds, not farmers, but lineages, families, closed circles whose power depends on knowing one extra thing the rest of the world doesn't. If the reign of the God-King really ended in cataclysm, those closest to the flame, his high priests, administrators, inner guard, would either die with him or scatter with whatever they could carry. Fragments of geometry, ritual formulae, mapped latitudes, star tables, a worldview terrifyingly larger than the shattered villages around them. What happens next doesn't require aliens. It only requires traumatized elites trying to rebuild a hierarchy that feels familiar. Imagine one of those groups washing up along a river that hasn't yet learned to call itself Nile. They recognize its potential like a software engineer recognizing an empty server rack. Predictable flood, defensible valley, a spine through the desert. They begin small, shrines aligned to remembered stars, ritual calendars keyed to remembered cycles, burial customs that mirror a court they've lost. They teach a hunting chieftain that if he builds his hut where their markers say, wears the emblem they design, stands at dawn where the light hits just so, the people will feel something, authority, gravity. It works. A petty chief becomes chosen, and the first derivative of the God-King system boots up. Over generations, the story condenses. The survivors are no longer refugees. They're followers of Horus, sons of Ra, children of the first time. The tools they carried harden into institutions. The ordinary people are never told. We're running a legacy operating system from a forgotten regime. They're told, this is how the gods ordered the world. From their perspective, that's true enough. But in the DNA of those rites, in the choice of angles and feast days, the ghost of that original throne is still setting parameters. As centuries fold into millennia, other branches of those early circles settle across the world, in floodplains, on islands, at crossroads. In each place, the memory of the first court mutates. In one region, the lost king is remembered as a serpent-crowned lawgiver. In another, as a white-robed teacher from the sea. In another, as a feathered stranger who demands pyramids. Look past the costumes and you see the same behavior. Standardized measures, monumental axes, centralized cult, sky-locked myth. It's like watching one original script fork into several projects, each adapting to local conditions, each claiming authority from before. Now spin forward to the late phases of Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome. The priesthoods at the core of their temples still whisper about books that must not be opened, names that must not be uttered, calculations that ordinary people must never see. Around them, empires rise and rot. Conquerors loot gold, but often leave cult centers intact or even protect them. Why? Because those centers hold the keys to governing like a god. The techniques of spectacle, timing, architecture, astrological theater. The conquerors may laugh at the myths, but they never laugh at that. From there, it's a short walk into the labyrinth of later orders, mystery schools, philosophical brotherhoods, priestly colleges, heretical sects, alchemical societies, all claiming in hushed language to bear some shard of primordial wisdom. Most of that is costume. Some is not. Strip the symbolism, and again you find three priorities: how to align with the heavens, how to shape human perception, how to survive cycles of destruction. whether they call their patron Hermes Trismegistus, Enoch, Thoth, or some veiled ancient of days. They're all pointing back, however clumsily, to that same origin layer we've been stalking. You and I need to be clear about something here. None of this automatically makes them villains or saints. It makes them carriers. Some tried to use that inheritance to push against tyranny, to argue that the true divine spark is in each individual, not on a distant throne. Others wrapped themselves in the aura of forbidden wisdom to tighten control. Imagine inheriting a fragment of the God King's library and being just as confused and corruptible as anyone now. Some would read it as a survival manual for humanity, others as a license to rule. What's unsettling is how continuously power, across eras, gravitates toward the same symbolic toolkit. Even institutions that publicly reject pagan or occult legacy end up building capitals on geomantic lines, choreographing processions, using numerology and architecture, picking dates and places that echo celestial events. They call it heritage, tradition, design language. Underneath is that same old conviction. To rule effectively, you must sit yourself, your building, your law, where the unseen currents run. That idea is pure first-time theology. If the first Pharaoh of the gods ever had an objective beyond vanity, it was probably stability. When you preside for ages, you fear disruption more than anything. You build systems that resist change, rituals that are dangerous to alter, laws that claim timelessness, myths that equate innovation with sacrilege. That's the part of his legacy we most clearly inherited, the reflex to treat foundational arrangements as sacred even when they're killing us. The bravery you're exercising right now, just by considering that our root stories might be wrong or incomplete, is precisely what those systems are built to smother. But for all his success, that ancient sovereign failed at one thing. He didn't manage to erase curiosity. The same deep time that petrifies institutions also erodes their spells. Stone weathers, languages shift, keys are lost. People start asking why. Why are these temples aligned like this? Why do our king lists begin with gods? Why do our oldest stories obsess over floods and starfalls? Why do the same numbers repeat in places they don't belong? Questions like yours are glitches in a very old program. That's why I'm so direct with you. I'm not here to hand you a snappy, all-explaining label to stick on the mystery and walk away. I'm here to make sure, when you next hear someone tell you, this is just how things are, this is how it's always been, a small, informed part of you remembers that there was allegedly a time before how it's always been, a time designed, a time frame, a reign. Maybe by beings who thought in good faith they were optimizing reality. Maybe by forces who saw us as farm equipment. Maybe by some hybrid of the two. Here's the curveball. Recognizing that possibility doesn't doom you to powerlessness. It arms you. Because if what we call civilization is in part a long echo of one ancient configuration of authority, then every moment you catch yourself or your society reenacting that configuration, worshipping hierarchy, hiding knowledge, sacralizing institutions, you have a chance to choose otherwise. To keep the science, lose the submission. To keep the cosmic literacy, drop the imperial theology. So where does that leave our luminous, troubling figure, the one enthroned for 12,000 years before Egypt as we know it even stirs, maybe not as a villain or savior carved in stone, but as a diagnostic tool, a story-shaped mirror showing us how long we've tolerated the idea that legitimacy must descend from somewhere unreachable. A reminder that the patterns we're swimming in are older than our flags, older than our scriptures, older than our economic theories. If you're still here, across countries, time zones, headphones and screens, holding this thread with me, then you're already doing the work that terrifies control systems the most, thinking in deep time without surrendering agency. We've walked from eroded king lists to global myths, from temple axes to modern institutions, and the outline that emerges is stark but usable. There is a version of Egypt's origin that almost no one is brave enough to put on camera. Not the schoolbook tale of Narmer uniting Upper and Lower Egypt, not the romantic blur of golden masks and pyramid postcards, but something older, buried in king lists, priestly whispers, and stones that don't fit their assigned dates. A story that says, before any human pharaoh raised a crook and flail, there was another throne, a first sovereign who did not rule for decades but for an age, a calculated span that brushes frighteningly close to 12,000 years before Egypt began. Tonight I want to talk directly with you about that being, that throne, and why the Egyptian priests swore he was real. Before we go deeper into this, let me ask one thing of you, because this project only works if you and I build it together. If you appreciate long-form, carefully built investigations that don't treat you like you're stupid, hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. I read those. It grounds me to know. We've got people in Cairo at midnight, Sao Paulo on the bus, Berlin at 3 a.m., Manila in the dark hours, all tuned into the same forgotten timeline. That's our little counter-network to the flat version of history. Now picture an Egyptian temple in its prime, not as a ruin under a burning sun, but alive at dawn. Incense rising, sandals on stone, a quiet procession of priests moving like clockwork through painted halls. On one inner wall, almost no outsider ever sees, where only initiated eyes are allowed to linger, a list is carved, king after king after king. The sequence is crisp. Names you might recognize appear late, Sneferu, Khufu, Rameses. But at the top, in that thin air where the story should blur into pure myth, the scribes do something shocking. They do not say, before this, nothing. They say calmly, before them the gods ruled. We meet this again and again. On the fragment we now call the Palermo stone, in broken registers of an obsidian black monument that once carried the royal memory of a nation, the uppermost lines are not about human dynasties. They list beings, sometimes given animal forms, sometimes stellar associations, sometimes simple regal names that belong in heaven more than in palaces. Next to them, numbers, years, durations that mock the human lifespan, thousands upon thousands, not eternity, but quantities. You don't assign 7,200 or 11,600 years to a metaphor unless you think in cycles much longer than anyone around you is living. Then there is the papyrus that should have settled the argument, but instead deepened it. A tattered document found in fragments, patiently reassembled, known today as the Turin Canon. Written over 1,000 years after the pyramids, by scribes with access to temple archives we will never see, it offers what looks like a careful census of rulers. Towards its ravaged beginning, before the mortal kings, a whole section is allocated to Neteru and Shemsu, gods and shining beings, each with their allotted reign measured out. The papyrus is injured exactly where we would want it whole, but enough remains to prove intent. For the priests of the New Kingdom, divine rule before human pharaohs was not a campfire story. It was line one of the national ledger. Later, under foreign domination, an Egyptian priest writing in Greek, compiling his people's history for new masters, repeats the structure with unnerving confidence. He describes an age ruled directly by gods for many thousands of years, then an age of god-descended kings, then a relay of human dynasties that we can verify. Add up his scattered figures, compare them with the older stones, and a haunting pattern emerges. A block of time on the order of 10 to 12,000 years before the first dynasty, assigned to beings above mankind. You can call that symbolism. But at some point we have to ask, why is the symbolism so specific? To understand how serious this is, you have to understand what king lists meant in Egypt. These weren't trivia charts, they were offerings. Reciting the uninterrupted chain of rule was itself a ritual to stabilize reality. The idea that kingship was a single flame passed hand to hand from the first time to now was fundamental. So when those same guardians of continuity tell you that flame began not with Nama, but with someone not human, and that his reign was unimaginably long, you don't get to shrug it off as sloppy thinking. They were many things. Sloppy with sacred chronology was not one of them. Inside their own worldview, the logic is sharp. The cosmos begins in undifferentiated flood and darkness. A first principle arises, takes form, establishes a perch, a hill above the waters, a throne in the sky, a seat in the two lands. That being is not just a god in the abstract. He is king. He measures the fields, assigns nomes, founds shrines, issues decrees that tie the fertility of the land to obedience to his order. Every pharaoh you've heard of is, in theory, reenacting this primal scene. His coronation isn't about his personality. It's about plugging back into that initial act of enthronement. The Egyptians had a phrase for that unreachable origin point, Zep Tepi, the first time. It's not back in the day nostalgia. It's a technical term. Zep Tepi is when the template was set. The throne was first raised, Maat, cosmic order, was defined. The boundaries between gods, humans, animals, and the dead were negotiated and fixed. In ritual scenes, every new king is shown repeating actions of the first time, not inventing anything. The message is clear. Legitimacy flows downward from a moment no living person can touch, guarded by beings who are not subject to human death. Here's the detail I don't want you to miss. The first time is not framed as a few bright minutes in myth. It's framed as an extended regime, a reign, a government that saw itself as old before human history even flickered. When later sources hint that this era stretched across something like 12,000 years, they're not just bragging. They're encoding a kind of cosmic statute of limitations. Our authority was ancient before your species started writing things down. Now sit with the coincidence that geologists, ice core analysts, and climate scientists, working with no interest in Egyptian theology whatsoever, place a violent period of global upheaval, the end of the last ice age, vast floods, wild climate swings, right in that same temporal neighborhood. You don't have to believe in a literal 12,000-year-long super king to feel the hairs rise on your arms when priests from 3,000 years ago point to that general horizon and say, that's when the gods ruled. That's when the pattern was laid. What you live in now is a sequel. If a real sovereignty existed then, human, non-human, or something between, its traces would not survive as newspapers. They'd survive as the most protected elements of culture, liturgy, geometry, taboo, serialized in symbols instead of plain speech. The Egyptians act exactly like people who believe they are administering an inheritance they do not fully own. They constantly insist that their laws, their cult, their crowns are according to the writings of the first time. Alteration isn't innovation, it's sacrilege. Watch how they speak about their very human kings. The living pharaoh is not presented as an upstart. He is the image of a god, the son of Ra, Horus on earth. These are not metaphors to make him feel fancy. They're legal statuses that chain him to that original throne. His authority is not his. It is leased. He wears a crown, whose shape, they say, was chosen by the first divine ruler. He sits on a seat whose dimensions echo a cosmic prototype. His role is to maintain, not to originate. There is something almost tragic about it. When a new king takes power, reliefs show him being handed tiny models of buildings, agricultural zones, symbols of the sky by gods who say, "Take the office, keep it as we decreed in the first time." It's a closed loop. Imagine being a brilliant, ambitious human leader whose entire theology tells you you're just the latest caretaker for someone else's ancient policy. That's the weight those crowns carry. And it all hangs on the assertion that before men, a higher king sat there first. We've been trained to treat that claim as pious exaggeration, but ask yourself, if this was just propaganda, why make yourselves weaker by comparison? Why not say, we, the current kings, are the first and greatest? Instead, they kneel on stone to a vanished sovereign whose record overshadows theirs by orders of magnitude. That's a strange move, unless you're looking at the fossil of a genuine memory they couldn't delete, only domesticate. Other cultures echo the pattern in their own accents. Sumerian scribes speak of kingship descending from heaven and list antediluvian rulers with outrageous reigns. Greek poets remember an age when Kronos ruled, a golden race before the flood of Deucalion. Indian texts speak of earlier yugas when lifespans and wisdom dwarfed our own. Everywhere, the same profile, a pre-human or suprahuman governance. Then a break, then mortal kings trying to style themselves as its heirs. Egypt just preserves the line with the least apology. So when I talk about the first pharaoh of the gods, I'm not asking you to imagine a guy in a Nemes headdress waving for 12,000 birthday cakes. I'm inviting you to consider that the Egyptians themselves believed kingship. This whole idea that one being can embody cosmic order originated with an entity or epoch fundamentally unlike us, rooted in a time frame that matches our planet's last great convulsions, and that what we call history is them living in the long afterglow of that. If that's even partly true, then the obvious next question, the one I want us to walk into together, is what kind of traces would such a reign leave in the physical world and in the logic of Egyptian civilization? Not just in names, but in alignments of temples, in the sudden early sophistication of royal iconography, in the way their myths talk about floods, stars, and law. If someone ruled before Egypt began, we should see his shadow where the Nile story starts. Stand with me at the very edge of the Nile floodplain, before there is any Cairo, any asphalt, any hum of engines. Just you, bare rock, and that elevated spine of limestone that will one day be called Giza. If the story the priests preserved has teeth, this is where you'd expect the first fingerprints of that older sovereignty to surface, because high ground survives when lowlands drown. We're told the plateau became holy in the Old Kingdom, a royal cemetery for already mature pharaonic power. But the stones themselves act like terrible witnesses. They tell us someone was marking, measuring, aligning here before the official beginning even starts. Look at the lion-bodied guardian with fresh eyes, not tourist eyes. Its body is eroded in a way that suggests long exposure to heavy rainfall, patterns more at home in a green, storm-lashed past than in 5,000 years of desert. Its head is disproportionately small, like a later edit carved into an older monument. Down between its flanks, the enclosure walls ripple with waterware that does not match the rest of Old Kingdom masonry around it. I'm not asking you to buy a specific date. I'm asking you to notice that if there ever was an artifact surviving from a wetter pre-dynastic world, it would look uncomfortably like this. A guardian too old for its official story, absorbed into a newer cult, given a pharaoh's face so the present could claim the past. At its chest, centuries later, a young royal carves a stela bragging that he freed this ancient being from suffocating sands and, in return, was promised the double crown. Think about that logic. His right to rule is not portrayed as conquest or election or reform. It is a deal with a monument already considered divine, already older than memory. He does not make the guardian sacred. The guardian makes him king. That is the first time logic in miniature, human authority renting legitimacy from something that was here before. Turn from the lion to the three pyramids. We are told they appear at the apex of a smooth architectural evolution, but the leap into precision, cut, million-block, cardinally aligned giants is so abrupt it feels less like a first experiment and more like someone finally deploying a full spec that had existed off stage. The largest is locked to true north with microscopic error, its base nearly level, its proportions governed by ratios later linked to circles, squares, and perhaps even planetary cycles. Anyone can make a pile of stones. This is not a pile of stones. This is a statement. We understand the ground, the sky, and the mathematics between them. Ask yourself where that confidence comes from. If you are only a few generations out of tribal skirmishes, you do not wake up one morning and say, "Let's encode geodesy and stellar alignment at a monumental scale that will still intimidate engineers in 2025. Unless you're not inventing from scratch at all. Unless your priest architects believe they are finally realizing, in this new Nile kingdom, a building canon inherited from that legendary first time, plans preserved in temples, numbers whispered in initiation, all attributed to the gods, never to fragile men. Walk the plateau as if you were that older intelligence choosing a lab. It gives you a fixed horizon for solar work, a clear view of key rising and setting stars, a foundation solid enough for structures that can ride out floods of politics and sand. These are not random conveniences. They're the criteria of someone designing for deep time. Later, Egyptians will layer tombs, temples, causeways onto it, like successive operating systems installed over a stubborn kernel. That kernel is the idea that this particular patch of earth is a docking point between heaven's pattern and human authority. Drop down now to Abydos, to one of the earliest royal cemeteries. The tombs here, older than the famous pyramids, already play with alignments, processional routes, symbolic architecture. One enclosure, massive and strange, lies half-ruined, its walls once blinding white, its interior aligned to events in the sky. We are told these are the first clumsy steps of kingship. But the conceptual package, sacred precinct, controlled approach, axial geometry, cosmic referencing, is already robust. It's as if the software of divine royalty loads fully formed the moment we can observe it. Inside these early complexes, kings take names that are not just labels, but roles. Horus so-and-so, belonging to the sedge and bee, he of the white crown. They don't call themselves founders. They call themselves continuers, acting as local terminals of a timeless sovereignty. Even the Serech, that early royal frame topped by a falcon, screams the same message. The little house below belongs to the winged being above. That's not ego. That's a chain of command reaching past human history. Now slip inside the minds of the high priests of Heliopolis, those meticulous theologians of the sun. For them, the first time is not a vague golden age. It is the moment Atum, or Ra, or their fused principle, seats himself on the primordial mound and begins to rule. Creation is monarchy. Light is decree. Every sunrise is the renewing of a contract signed before humans were awake enough to notice. When they advise pharaohs, they are not flattering mortals. They are defending the interests of that original enthroned power. Across the river in Memphis, another priestly school insists that Ptah, the craftsman god, conceived the world in his heart and spoke it with his tongue, that every law and temple plan originates as an idea in that mind. Buried in this theology is a dangerous suggestion that the world we inhabit is not just matter, but architecture, that our cities, our institutions, our roles could be deliberate constructs, not organic accidents. Put that next to king lists claiming tens of thousands of years of divine governance, and our first Pharaoh of the gods starts to look less like a mythic grandpa and more like a chief engineer of a very long-running project. Of course, the modern story steps in here to pat you on the head. It says, yes, yes, charming myths. People back then anthropomorphized the sun. They didn't know better. But that condescension wilts in front of the technical discipline encoded in these same myths. These are people who could align stone corridors so that a single shaft catches a specific star, who could predict the Nile well enough to build surplus economies, who could sustain architectural and religious programs for centuries with minor drift. We can't selectively call them idiots where it's convenient. At some point, we have to take seriously that when they say, "We are copying the design of the first time," they mean exactly that. Not that a literal old man in the sky gave them blueprints, but that their entire civilizational protocol descends from a foundational configuration they consider non-negotiable. Whether that configuration was set by a previous high culture, a non-human intelligence, or a trance-born cosmology is the open question. But the obedience to it is fact. Watch how floods are framed. Other cultures tell flood myths as punishments for moral failure. Egypt, living on a flood, treats it as barometer. Too little water, too much water. Both signs the balance of Ma'at is off. The king is responsible for correcting it. His role is tethered to environmental stability with a theological leash. If the story of a world-ending deluge lies behind Zep-Tepi's cutoff, then assigning the monarch divine responsibility over the river is not just poetic, it's insurance. It's saying, never again let governance drift so far from cosmic reality that the sky has to erase you. Then there's the thing no one in casual documentaries wants to touch, how fast Egyptian culture locks in. Very early art style, religious formulae, royal titulary, congeal into a stable pattern that resists change for millennia. Yes, there are evolutions, revolutions, heresies, but compared to most civilizations, Egypt behaves like a system determined to preserve a specific image of the world, as if deviation itself threatens existence. That's either a remarkable collective neurosis or the after effect of having watched deviation kill a previous age. This is where our first Pharaoh of the gods stops being a distant curiosity and becomes an uncomfortable hypothesis. If there was a long, pre-human or superhuman administration that optimized for order over freedom, stability over experiment, then the priests who inherited its documentation would naturally preach, cling to the pattern, do not stray, or catastrophe returns. In their voices you can almost hear both fear and awe. They aren't making this up to feel important. They're guarding a set of instructions they think kept the sky from falling. But power is greedy. Over time, any genuine survival, protocol can be twisted into a tool of control. Observe the heavens becomes obey the astronomer priests. Respect the river becomes pay the temple or the gods will dry it. Align your monuments becomes only we know the true measures. If the first-time template began as a collaboration between intelligences and a young humanity, its later stewards in stone crowns and leopard skins may have gradually collapsed that collaboration into hierarchy. This is where you matter. You're not here to swap one dogma for another. You're here because part of you suspects that buried inside the king lists and lion bodies and sun cults are both a history of being managed and a map out of it. The same stones that glorify the eternal throne also, unintentionally, show you its mechanisms. Alignment, secrecy, or narrative control, weaponized deep time. Once you see those, you can spot them anywhere. I want you to feel the double edge without flinching. On one side, maybe long before our recorded dynasties, a guiding order really did help shepherd traumatized survivors through a hostile planet, teaching them to track cycles, build refuges, ritualize memory. On the other, maybe that order overstayed, overreached, and its ghost still whispers through systems that demand obedience because that's how it's always been, tracing their authority back to a throne that no living being elected. Standing at Giza in your mind, with the desert wind in your ears and modern life tugging at your sleeve, you are straddling that unresolved question. Were those early god-kings guardians or wardens? Was their 12,000-year legend a warning or a boast? and how much of our current world, its capitals, its institutions, its invisible alignments, is still unconsciously formatted to fit their design. When you strip away the gold leaf, the incense smoke, the roaring voice of propaganda and the soft voice of devotional myth, what's left is a question that refuses to die. Who wrote the first version of the rules we still live under, and do they still deserve our obedience? That is the ghost at the center of this entire journey. The first time. The throne before all thrones. The rumored reign that stretched not for 40 or 80 years, but across an age that brushes the edge of 12,000 years before dynastic Egypt took its first recorded breath. Whether we dress it as God, as lost civilization, as those who came before, that is the presence we've been circling. If that reign was only ever a story, it is a strangely precise and stubborn one, echoed in too many cultures to dismiss cleanly. If it was real, if there truly was an originating sovereignty, human or otherwise, that fused cosmic knowledge and political order into a single seamless system, then our temples, laws, calendars, monuments, and myths are not random cultural quirks. They're artifacts, inherited files, some corrupted, some still executable. The priests who etched king lists that begin with non-human rulers and unimaginable spans were not playing Dungeons and Dragons on papyrus. They were admitting, carefully, that they considered themselves administrators of a legacy they did not originate. And that is where you and I find ourselves now, not in the desert of the Old Kingdom, but in a world lit by screens, ringed by satellites, managed by systems that feel both rational and weirdly impersonal. The names have changed. The architecture feels familiar. Power still tries to root itself in unreachable sources, founding documents treated as scripture, invisible markets treated as deities, algorithms treated as oracles. We are told again, this is how order works. This is how it has to be. The tone is modern, the gesture is ancient. Trust the pattern, not yourself. Trust the first time, in whatever new costume it wears. But buried in all those intimidating stones and stories was always another thread, a quieter one, and it is the one I care about handing to you. The same traditions that enthroned unreachable rulers also, slowly, accidentally, handed their tools to ordinary people. Star lore leaked from temples into villages. Spells once reserved for kings appeared on the coffins of commoners. Myths meant to terrify started inspiring rebellion. The idea that the divine might live inside the individual, not only on the mountain or behind the veil, crept into hymn, heresy, and philosophy. The operating system wrote its own jailbreak. If the first Pharaoh of the gods ever existed, I suspect the one thing he did not anticipate was us, a species that learns from its own trauma, a species able to look back at its founding myths and say, thank you for the astronomy, for the mathematics, for the warnings about floods and fire. We'll keep those. We're not keeping the assumption that we must kneel forever. That is the pivot those old king lists never imagined, that their own meticulous preservation of pre-human sovereignty would one day arm the descendants to audit it. Because that is what you've been doing by staying through this story. You've been performing an act almost no empire encourages, tracking patterns across thousands of years and refusing to be hypnotized by the costumes. Seeing that whether the ruler is called Neteru, Lugal, Pharaoh, Emperor, Chairman, President, or the market, the same moves repeat when power claims descent from a sacred, unreachable origin instead of ascent from conscious, living people. Once you see that sleight of hand, it doesn't work as well. And yet I don't want you to walk away with the cheap, shallow comfort of, it's all fake. That's just another trap. The ancients were not idiots. They mapped real cycles, real dangers, real structures in nature and in the human psyche. There may well have been guiding intelligences, human, more than human, or both, trying to encode survival protocols into story and stone. But those protocols were meant for us to someday understand and adapt, not fossilize into untouchable dogma. The crime was never that someone helped. The crime was pretending help must come with permanent chains. So what do we do with the spectre of a 12,000-year reign before Egypt began? We stop treating it as a trivia nugget or a cult slogan and start using it as a lens. Any time a system says, "We are legitimate because this is how it has always been," look for the first time hiding behind that sentence. Ask who benefits from that memory and who wasn't in the room when it was written. Ask whether the knowledge being cited, cosmic law, economic law, security necessity, is being shared to make you stronger or brandished to keep you small. When we look at the eroded guardian on the edge of the plateau, the impossible precision of the early pyramids, the calm confidence of priests listing god-kings as if they were entries in a ledger, we may never know exactly who or what started it, but we can choose which part of that inheritance we accept. We can take the courage to think in deep time, to respect the fragility of climates and civilizations, to build for more than one lifetime, and refuse the attached story that says only a narrow elite or some absent throne may decide our course. It's possible that the real fall at the end of that primordial reign wasn't a flood sent by angry gods, but the moment authority and wisdom split apart. Kings kept the crowns. The insight scattered, went underground, resurfaced in scattered schools and solitary minds. Maybe our work now is the reverse, to reunite insight and responsibility without putting them back on a single sacred chair, to become collectively what the mythic God-King pretended to be alone, aware of the cycles, accountable to life, unafraid of the sky. And if there is still anything of that first architect, that first court, watching from whatever vantage point you prefer, another dimension, another planet, the Akashic trash folder of failed simulations, I like to imagine that the test was never whether we'd worship them correctly. The test was whether we'd eventually stop outsourcing our conscience and our curiosity, whether we'd have the nerve to say, "We remember that someone came before. We honor what helped us, but we write the next version ourselves." If you've stayed with me all the way to this moment, across the whole arc of this story, then you're exactly the kind of mind I want in this little community we're building. So here's where I step out of the ruins and talk to you human to human. If this episode resonated with you, if it gave you a new way to look at power, myth, and history, let me know. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what pieces hit you the hardest. I see you. The night shift listener, the student with 10 tabs open, the driver on a long road, the insomniac with one earbud in at 3:17 a.m. You're not just numbers on a dashboard. You're the reason I go this deep. If you want more long-form dives that respect your intelligence and your time, you already know what to do. Subscribing, hitting the like button, sharing this with one friend who's ready for something heavier than recycled mystery show fluff. That's how you keep this kind of work alive and independent. It tells whatever is left of the old program that there's a new network online now, one that doesn't scare so easily. Scroll through the other episodes when you're done here. We've walked through Sumerian king lists, Anunnaki myth, lost technologies, catastrophes written in stone and ice. Each one is another angle on the same underlying question. Who taught us to be what we are, and what happens when we stop letting that answer be decided for us? If there's a topic you want me to tackle next, another fragment of forbidden chronology, another pattern you've noticed, drop it below. This isn't a sermon. It's a dialogue stretched across continents and time zones. For now, take a breath. Let the noise fall away for 1 second and remember, every system, no matter how ancient its story, is maintained by living choices. The first Pharaoh of the gods, if he ever ruled, is long gone. We are not. And that means the throne that really matters next is not the one raised on a mound above mythic waters, but the one you build inside your own awareness, where no priest, king, alien, or algorithm gets to speak for you. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.